The warm evening breeze carried the scent of myrrh and olive oil as David stepped onto the rooftop of his palace. The sun had set beyond the horizon, leaving behind a dim glow that bathed the city of Jerusalem in soft gold. From where he stood, he could see the rooftops of the houses below, hear the distant voices of merchants closing their shops, and the sounds of laughter drifting from homes where families gathered to eat. David exhaled deeply. He was restless. For years, he had been a warrior. He had led battles, fought against giants, conquered lands. He had stood before kings as a shepherd and had walked away as a ruler. But tonight, there was no war for him to fight, no enemies to slay. Joab, his most trusted general, had taken the army to battle against the Ammonites. And for the first time in a long while, David had chosen to stay behind. At first, it had seemed like a wise decision. He had earned the right to rest. His kingdom was strong, his people at peace. Yet, as the night stretched on, his restlessness grew. He felt like a caged lion, pacing, searching for something he could not name. That was when he saw her. A woman stood on a rooftop just across the courtyard. The moonlight illuminated her as she dipped her hands into a basin, pouring water over her body. David's breath caught in his throat. Her skin glowed in the silver light, the curves of her figure moving gracefully as she ran her fingers through her long, dark hair. She was unaware of his gaze, unaware that the most powerful man in Israel stood above her, watching. David's heart pounded. He had seen beautiful women before. His palace was filled with wives and concubines, women who had been given to him through alliances, women who had come willingly into his embrace. But this was different. This woman's beauty struck him like a blade to the chest. "Who is she?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. His servant, standing a few steps behind him, hesitated. "She is Bathsheba, daughter of Eliam," the servant finally said. "The wife of Uriah the Hittite." Wife. The word echoed in David's mind. The wife of Uriah. David knew Uriah well. He was not just any soldier. He was one of his mighty men, a warrior who had fought beside him in battle, bled for Israel, risked his life for the kingdom. He should have turned away. He should have silenced the thoughts that burned in his mind. But instead, he found himself leaning over the edge of the rooftop, unable to take his eyes off her. "Bring her to me," he said, the command slipping from his lips before he could stop it. The servant hesitated again, as if considering the weight of the king's words. Then, with a slight bow, he disappeared into the darkness. David turned back to the city, his pulse racing. He tried to reason with himself. Perhaps he only wanted to speak with her, to hear her voice, to see if she was as captivating up close as she was from afar. But deep down, he knew the truth. His desire had already taken root. The room was dimly lit by oil lamps when Bathsheba was brought before him. She had wrapped herself in a fine robe, her damp hair still clinging to her neck. There was a mixture of curiosity and nervousness in her eyes as she looked at him. "My lord," she said, bowing slightly. David stepped forward, studying her face. Up close, she was even more beautiful than he had imagined. Her lips were full, her eyes deep and dark like the waters of a hidden well. "I trust you were not troubled by the summons," David said, his voice smooth. Bathsheba met his gaze, but said nothing. There was an unspoken question in her eyes. Why had the king called for her? David knew he should tread carefully. She was not a servant, not a concubine from his harem. She was the wife of a warrior, a woman who belonged to another man. But in that moment, the lines between right and wrong blurred. He reached out, gently touching a strand of her damp hair. "You are even lovelier than I imagined," he murmured. Bathsheba's breath hitched. He could see the hesitation in her expression, the conflict warring within her. But she did not pull away. David's fingers traced the curve of her cheek, and then slowly, he leaned in. She did not resist. The fire that had been smoldering in him ignited fully, and as the night stretched on, David took what was not his to take. The morning light filtered through the high windows as David sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the wooden beams above him. Bathsheba lay beside him, wrapped in the sheets, her breathing soft and steady. David ran a hand through his hair, his thoughts tangled. He should have felt satisfied. Instead, a strange unease settled over him. He pushed it aside. It was done. No one would ever know. Bathsheba stirred, her eyes fluttering open. When she turned to face him, there was something unreadable in her gaze. "I should go," she whispered. David nodded. He did not offer words of reassurance, nor did she ask for them. Moments later, she was gone, leaving only the lingering scent of her perfume behind. David exhaled and rose from the bed, shaking off the remnants of the night. He had a kingdom to rule. There were matters to attend to, decisions to make. Soon, this would be nothing but a fleeting memory, or so he thought. Days turned into weeks, and David had almost convinced himself that the night with Bathsheba had been an isolated moment. He had pushed the memory aside, focusing on matters of state, attending court, hearing disputes among his people. Then one morning, as he sat in the palace hall, a messenger arrived. He carried a small parchment, sealed with wax. David took it and broke the seal. His eyes scanned the words. His breath caught. "I am with child." The ink on the parchment blurred as David stared at it, his mind reeling. With child, Bathsheba was pregnant. David's grip on the parchment tightened. This was no longer a fleeting mistake. This was something that could not be hidden, could not be ignored. If word got out, the consequences would be devastating. A woman carrying the child of a man who was not her husband. Such an offense could result in her being stoned. Even worse, if people discovered that the king had taken a soldier's wife in his absence, the scandal would spread like wildfire. David stood abruptly, his heart pounding. He had to act quickly. He could not undo what had been done, but he could control what happened next. He called for his scribe and took a deep breath before speaking. "Send word to Joab," he ordered. "Summon Uriah the Hittite back to Jerusalem at once." The scribe bowed and left. David clenched his fists. If Uriah came home and lay with his wife, the child would be assumed to be his. No one would ever suspect. No one would ever know the truth. At least, that was what David told himself. What he did not know was that his deception was only beginning, and that soon his sin would set in motion events he could not control. The sun had barely risen when the call came. Uriah the Hittite stood among his fellow soldiers, his armor streaked with the dust of battle. The war against the Ammonites had raged for weeks, yet he had never wavered. His sword had tasted blood, his shield had blocked countless strikes, and his heart had remained steadfast in its duty to Israel. So when a messenger arrived at the camp, breathless and urgent, Uriah listened intently. "The king has summoned you," the man announced. Uriah exchanged a glance with his comrades, his forehead creased. Summoned by the king? In the middle of a campaign? Joab, the army's general, approached. "It seems urgent," he said, though there was a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. Uriah bowed. "Then I will go." He gathered his weapons and departed immediately, leaving the battlefield behind, unaware that his fate had already been sealed. The journey to Jerusalem was uneventful, but Uriah could not shake the unease that settled in his chest. He had served King David for years. He had fought beside him when David was still a warrior, before he had become Israel's most powerful ruler. Uriah had bled for him, followed him into battle, pledged his loyalty without question. And yet, something about this sudden summons felt wrong. When he arrived at the palace gates, the guards ushered him in quickly. Unlike the battlefield, where the air smelled of sweat and iron, the palace carried the scent of cinnamon, wine, and burning incense. A servant led him to the throne room, where King David sat, reclining in comfort. He was dressed in fine robes, his crown glinting under the torchlight. He smiled as Uriah entered, but the smile did not quite reach his eyes. "Uriah, my faithful warrior," David greeted warmly. "How fares the battle?" Uriah knelt before him. "My lord," The war progresses well. Joab leads the men bravely. The Ammonites weaken with each strike. David nodded, seemingly satisfied. Good. There was a pause, an unnatural one. Uriah waited, his instincts sharpening. Then, David gestured to a servant, who immediately brought forth a goblet of wine. "You have been away for so long, my friend," David said smoothly, handing him the cup. "You must be weary. Drink, eat, go down to your house, and rest. Your wife must miss you dearly." Uriah stiffened. Go home, rest. It was true that he had been away for months. He had thought of Bathsheba often, imagined the warmth of her embrace, the softness of her lips. But how could he indulge in comfort while his fellow soldiers still slept in the open fields, their lives at risk? His grip tightened around the goblet, but he did not drink. "My lord," he said, his voice steady, "the ark of God, the army of Israel, and my commander Joab all dwell in tents. They fight, they suffer. How can I go home and lie with my wife when my brothers in arms endure hardship?" David's expression flickered for just a second. His fingers drummed against the armrest of his throne. Uriah did not look away. "I cannot do such a thing," he finished. The words hung in the air. David forced a smile, though his jaw was tight. "You are a man of great honor, Uriah." But beneath the praise, something dark stirred in the king's eyes. That night, Uriah did not return home. Instead, he unrolled his cloak and lay down outside the palace, near the entrance where the other servants rested. The stone floor was cold beneath him, but he did not mind. He had endured far worse in battle. He closed his eyes, his thoughts drifting briefly to Bathsheba. He missed her. Of course he did. He could almost hear her voice, feel her fingers against his skin. But duty came first. He was a soldier before he was a husband. If only he had known the storm that brewed above him. David stood at the window, watching, his fists clenched. He had underestimated Uriah. He had thought that summoning him home would be enough, that the warrior would rush into his wife's arms, and the child in Bathsheba's womb would be mistaken for his own. But Uriah was too loyal, too noble. David turned away, running a hand through his hair. He could not let this stand. If Uriah did not sleep with Bathsheba, the truth would come out. People would count the months of her pregnancy. Whispers would start. David, the man after God's own heart, would be exposed for what he had done. No, he would not let that happen. A new plan formed in his mind. One more desperate, more dangerous. The next evening, David called Uriah again. This time, he did not ask him to go home immediately. Instead, he insisted Uriah eat with him, drink with him. David poured him wine, cup after cup, ensuring that the soldier's senses dulled, that his mind fogged. Uriah laughed, his cheeks flushed from the drink. He spoke freely, his body swaying slightly as the effects of the wine set in. David leaned back, satisfied. Surely now, in this drunken state, Uriah would stagger home, fall into his wife's embrace, and everything would be resolved. But even in his intoxicated state, Uriah's loyalty remained unshaken. Once again, he did not return to Bathsheba. Once again, he slept outside, among the palace guards. David's patience snapped. He had given Uriah 2 chances to cover this mistake. Uriah's loyalty, once an admirable trait, now became an obstacle, a threat. If Uriah would not serve as a shield for David's sin, then he would be removed permanently. The next morning, David sat at his desk, staring at the parchment before him. His hands trembled slightly as he dipped his quill into ink. The words he was about to write would determine the fate of a man who had fought for him, trusted him, honored him. Yet, David did not stop. With slow, deliberate strokes, he wrote the order. Set Uriah in the forefront of the fiercest battle, and withdraw from him, that he may be struck down and die. He sealed the letter with his royal insignia. Then, without hesitation, he handed it to Uriah himself. "Deliver this to Joab," David instructed. Uriah took the letter without question, bowed, and departed. He did not know that the very letter he carried in his hands was his death sentence. David watched him leave, his stomach twisting. He had silenced his conscience for now. But deep down, he knew this would not go unnoticed. God had seen it, and soon the reckoning would come. The morning air was cool as Uriah rode back to the battlefield. His thoughts were simple: loyalty, duty, honor. He had delivered the king's message to Joab as instructed, but a part of him still wondered why David had summoned him home in the first place. Something about the visit did not sit right. He had known David for years. The king was not only a leader but a warrior, a man who understood the battlefield. Yet, the summons had been strange. The insistence that he go home to his wife while his fellow soldiers still fought. It had been unlike David. But Uriah was not a man to question orders. He was a soldier, bound to obedience. Still, a sense of unease settled in his chest as he neared the military encampment. His fellow soldiers greeted him as he returned, clasping his arms, welcoming him back. He shared news from the capital. Brief reports, nothing of importance. He did not mention Bathsheba. He did not mention the king's peculiar insistence that he go home. Instead, he focused on the battle. Rabbah still stood, its walls defiant against Israel's forces. Joab had planned another attack, one that would press deeper into the city's defenses. Uriah listened carefully, his fingers tightening around the hilt of his sword. Another battle, another chance to prove his worth. He was ready. That night, in the command tent, Joab sat alone. The letter from David lay open before him, the ink still fresh, the royal seal broken. Set Uriah in the forefront of the fiercest battle, and withdraw from him, that he may be struck down and die. Joab exhaled slowly, rubbing his temples. He had fought beside Uriah for years. He had watched him carve through enemy lines, had seen him stand against overwhelming odds and emerge victorious. And now, he was ordered to ensure that same warrior did not return from battle. Joab was not a righteous man. He had committed his own sins, made his own ruthless decisions in the name of the king. But this was different. This was an execution disguised as war. For the first time in a long while, Joab hesitated. Then, with a heavy heart, he called for his officers. The plan would proceed. Uriah would die. The next morning, the Israelite forces assembled at the edge of the battlefield. The walls of Rabbah loomed ahead, the enemy archers positioned high above, watching. Joab stood with his officers, his expression unreadable. "Today we push forward," he announced. "We will attack the city's gate directly. It will be dangerous, but we have no choice if we are to break their defenses." The soldiers murmured among themselves. Attacking the gate was a foolish tactic, reckless, nearly suicidal. But they would not question the command. Joab turned his gaze toward Uriah. "You will lead the charge," he said. Uriah's chest swelled with pride. His heart pounded. "Yes, my lord." His hands flexed around his sword. This was what he lived for. The fight, the honor, the chance to serve his king and country. The war drum sounded. With a fierce cry, Uriah led his men forward, charging toward the enemy's gate. The archers above moved quickly, the air filled with the sharp whistle of arrows. Uriah lifted his shield, deflecting the first wave of attacks. He reached the base of the walls, striking down an Ammonite soldier with a single blow. His men fought beside him, their swords clashing against enemy steel. For a moment, it felt like any other battle. Then, without warning, the Israelite forces began to pull back. Uriah did not notice at first. He was too focused, too deep in the fight. It was only when he turned to give a command that he realized his men were gone. The battlefield behind him was empty. His reinforcements had withdrawn. His breath caught. He was alone. The enemy pressed forward. He fought, his blades slicing through armor, his shield blocking strike after strike. But there were too many. A spear found its mark, piercing his thigh. He staggered. Another blade slashed across his side. His grip on his sword loosened. His vision blurred. He fell to his knees, the shouts of battle echoing around him. He gasped for breath, tasting blood. And then an arrow struck him squarely in the chest. The pain was instant, sharp, final. The world tilted. The sky above blurred into a swirl of color. And then nothing. Uriah the Hittite, one of Israel's mightiest warriors, was dead. Back in Jerusalem, David sat in his chamber, drumming his fingers against the wooden armrest of his throne. He had not slept well. The tension in his chest had not eased since Uriah left. He kept telling himself that this was the only way, that there had been no other choice, that Uriah's death was necessary. A part of him believed it. Another part, the part that had once knelt before God as a humble shepherd, was not so sure. A knock came at the door. David straightened. Enter. A messenger stepped inside, his head bowed. "My lord." Joab sends word from the battlefield. David's breath caught. The battle was fierce. The messenger continued. Many men fell, and among them, he hesitated. "Speak," David commanded, though his throat felt tight. "Uriah the Hittite is dead." "Silence." David exhaled, his shoulders slumping slightly. The weight in his chest eased. "It is war," he said, his voice steady. "The sword devours one as well as another." The words felt hollow. The messenger bowed and left. David sat alone, staring at the floor. It was done. Uriah was gone. His mistake was buried. No one would ever know. The days that followed were ones of mourning. Bathsheba wept for her husband. The city whispered about the tragedy. The brave warrior who had fallen in battle, the widow left behind. David watched from a distance, his guilt masked behind a veil of solemnity. He did what was expected. When the mourning period ended, he took Bathsheba as his wife. To the people, it seemed like an act of kindness. A noble king, taking in the widow of a fallen soldier. No one questioned it. No one suspected the truth. But God had seen everything, and God was not pleased. Late at night, when David lay beside Bathsheba, sleep did not come easily. He would close his eyes and see Uriah's face. He would hear the sounds of battle, the echo of swords clashing, the whistle of arrows in the wind, and he would see blood. His hands were clean, yet he felt them stained with the life of a man who had trusted him. The burden of that knowledge sat heavy on his soul, but he told himself it was over. He told himself that he had escaped judgment. What he did not know was that judgment was already on its way. A prophet was coming. A reckoning had begun. David sat on the royal balcony, overlooking Jerusalem as the sun dipped below the horizon. A golden glow bathed the city, and the sound of distant lyres filled the air. He should have felt peace. His kingdom was secure, his throne unchallenged, his enemies subdued. Bathsheba lay in his chambers, carrying his child, the son of a king. The scandal had been buried with Uriah, sealed beneath the chaos of war. And yet, peace eluded him. The nights were the worst. Sleep did not come easily. When he closed his eyes, he saw the battlefield. He saw Uriah standing among his men, his sword drawn, his face grim. He saw him fighting alone, arrows piercing his armor, blood staining the sand. In his dreams, Uriah turned to face him. "My king," he would whisper, his voice hollow. David would wake in a cold sweat every single night, but he buried his guilt. He told himself it was over. He told himself God had looked away. Then one afternoon, a familiar voice called out in the palace halls, "Prophet Nathan has arrived." David straightened. He had not expected a visit from the prophet. Nathan was a man of wisdom, a messenger of God. His words carried weight, and his presence often signaled something important. David rose from his seat, adjusting his robes. "Let him in," he commanded. Nathan entered, his steps measured, his gaze sharp. He was an older man, his hair streaked with silver, his eyes knowing. He did not bow. He did not greet David with the usual pleasantries. David frowned slightly. The prophet had come with a purpose. Nathan stood before the king, his expression unreadable. "My lord," he began, "I have a story to tell you." David folded his arms, intrigued. "There were two men in a city," Nathan continued. "One was rich, the other poor. The rich man had many flocks and herds. The poor man had nothing except one little lamb." David nodded, listening. Nathan's voice remained steady. "The poor man loved his lamb. It ate from his plate, drank from his cup, and slept in his arms. It was like a daughter to him." David could picture it. The humble man cradling the small lamb, feeding it with his own hands, cherishing it as his most valuable possession. But then, Nathan continued, a traveler came to visit the rich man, and instead of taking one of his many sheep to prepare a meal, the rich man took the poor man's only lamb. He slaughtered it and fed it to his guest. David's jaw tightened. His fingers curled into fists. A deep rage stirred within him. "This man deserves to die," David declared. His voice rang through the chamber, filled with righteous anger. "He must pay 4 times over for what he has done." Silence followed. Nathan stared at him. Then, in a quiet voice, the prophet spoke words that struck like a thunderclap. "You are that man." David froze. His heart pounded violently in his chest. "You are the man who took what did not belong to him," Nathan continued. "The Lord anointed you king over Israel. He gave you victory over your enemies. He gave you wealth, power, wives, and dominion over this land. And yet, you took Uriah's wife for yourself." David's breath caught. Nathan took a step closer, his voice unwavering. "You had Uriah struck down by the sword of the Ammonites. You thought no one would see. You thought God would not notice." David trembled, but he did. The weight of those words crushed him. Nathan's gaze was piercing. "Now hear the word of the Lord. The sword will never depart from your house. You have despised God by your actions. Because of this, calamity will rise from within your own household." David's mouth went dry. Nathan's voice darkened. "You took another man's wife in secret, but what will come upon you will be done in the open, for all to see." David's knees buckled. The walls of the palace suddenly felt too close, the air too thick. And then Nathan spoke the final blow. "The child born to you will die." David gasped. "No," he whispered. His chest heaved. "No, Lord, please." But Nathan did not waver. "The Lord has taken away your sin," he said. "You shall not die, but the child will." Then, without another word, the prophet turned and left, leaving David shattered in his wake. That night, the palace was silent. David sat alone in the dimly lit chamber, his hands gripping his knees. Guilt, like an iron weight, pressed down on him. He had sinned. He had taken what was not his. He had murdered an innocent man. And now, his child would pay the price. Tears welled in his eyes. For the first time in years, the mighty king fell to the ground, his face against the cold stone floor. He wept. He tore his garments, his body shaking with sobs. He called out to the God he had once walked so closely with. "Have mercy on me, O God, according to your unfailing love. Blot out my transgressions. Wash away my iniquity and cleanse me from my sin. Against you only have I sinned and done what is evil in your sight." He wept until he could weep no more. He fasted for days, refusing food, refusing comfort. He lay in the dust, praying, pleading. But the judgment of the Lord had been spoken. And when the 7th day came, the child fell ill. Bathsheba wept beside him, her cries echoing through the halls. David sat by the child's side, his hands trembling as he stroked the boy's tiny head. "Lord, please," he whispered, "please." But the fever worsened, and on the 7th night, the child died. The palace servants hesitated before bringing David the news. They feared his reaction. feared what grief might do to their king. When David saw their hushed whispers, their downcast eyes, he knew. He inhaled sharply, pressing his palms against the floor. Slowly he rose. He did not scream. He did not weep. Instead, he stood, dusted the ashes from his robes, and walked toward the chamber where he kept his sacred garments. He bathed, dressed in clean robes, anointed himself with oil. Then, to the shock of his servants, he went to the temple of the Lord, and he worshipped. The servants did not understand. "My lord," one of them asked hesitantly, "why do you fast and weep while the child is alive, but when he dies, you rise and eat?" David turned, his eyes tired but steady. "When the child was alive, I thought, perhaps the Lord will be merciful. But now he is gone. I cannot bring him back." He exhaled softly. "But one day, I will go to him." That night, Bathsheba wept in his arms. David held her close, his fingers running through her hair. Pain lingered between them, but so did something else, a glimmer of hope. For though God had taken their firstborn, he was not finished with them yet, and in time, he would grant them another son, a child who would one day rule Israel with wisdom beyond measure, a child named Solomon. But for now, David carried his grief. He had paid the price for his sins, but he had also found something greater: forgiveness. If you enjoyed this story and want to explore more powerful biblical narratives, make sure to subscribe to Echoes of the Bible for inspiring content every week. Hit the like button, leave a comment, and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Thank you for being part of our community.